Hi everyone. The issue of the true nature of the Anglo-Saxon migration is something which continues to be debated. It's one of the most controversial aspects of the origin of the English. But in recent years, genetic studies have revealed a lot that can help us. So first of all, the traditional narrative is that in the early medieval era, just after the Romans left, the Britons were facing attacks from the Picts and the Scots. So they hired Germanic mercenaries, the Anglo-Saxons, to help them to defend their shores. So they settled the Anglo-Saxons in a part of eastern Britain, and then the Anglo-Saxons did their job for a while, but they became discontent and they started conquering land for themselves. And so that led to the Anglo-Saxon conquest of what's now England. And during that time, there was mass migration from Germany over to England. This took place over a long period of time. It wasn't just something that happened in a few years or a few decades. It was basically from the mid-5th century right through to 600. There was regular migration involved. But the point is, mass migration is what resulted in the formation of the English. The English then, supposedly, according to the traditional narrative, are, by and large, descendants of these Germanic settlers, the Anglo-Saxons. That's the traditional narrative. But a few decades ago, probably around the 1970s or thereabouts, things started to shift in the world of academia, and historians more and more decided that there wasn't evidence of a violent migration or mass migration, and that there was actually just a semi-peaceful migration, or maybe not even much of a migration at all. Some minimalists, like Francis Pryor, they argued that basically there was no migration whatsoever, and that the Britons just adopted Anglo-Saxon culture because it was stylish to them at the time. So they adopted the language, religion, and material culture of the Anglo-Saxons just because they wanted to, and there was no actual mass migration whatsoever. That's the minimalist view, and it really is as absurd as it sounds, but unfortunately that became very, very popular over the course of many years. Now, however, genetic studies have clarified the matter. So what have genetic studies revealed? Well, let's look at a few genetic studies, because when we look over the past 10 years, we find that there have been a few different ones which have contributed to this debate in different ways. So in 2015, there was a study which analysed modern populations, the genetics of modern populations, to try to ascertain the true scale of the Anglo-Saxon migration. So this looked at the modern genetics of the English and compared it to the Welsh and the Germans. And what it found is that English DNA seems to only be composed of about 10 to 40% Germanic, so to speak, DNA. So that seems to confirm that there wasn't a mass migration, or at least the Anglo-Saxons didn't overwhelmingly outnumber the native Britons, and that most of the English are actually descendants not of Anglo-Saxon settlers from Germany, but the native Britons who were already living there. So in other words, most of the English aren't Germanic, they're Brythonic. They share more DNA with the Welsh. The problem, of course, is that this relies on modern DNA, and there's no guarantee that modern DNA necessarily reflects the scale of migration in the past, because it could be that since then there have been other migration events which have perhaps mixed in more Brythonic DNA into the modern English than there was hundreds of years ago. So that's one obvious flaw with this study. Then, in 2016, there was another study which partially resolved the issue. Rather than comparing modern English DNA to modern German DNA, they compared modern English DNA with the DNA found in medieval graves of people who are believed to be Anglo-Saxons. So in other words, they looked at Anglo-Saxon grave sites, they took DNA samples from those remains, and they compared that with the modern English DNA. So in a sense, it's similar to the previous study, but instead of comparing it to German DNA in modern times, they compared it to what was apparently medieval Anglo-Saxon DNA. And they found very much the same thing. They found that English DNA, modern English DNA, reflects about 25 to 50% Anglo-Saxon DNA, based on those Anglo-Saxon medieval samples that they found. So again, that seems to confirm that the Anglo-Saxon migration wasn't violent enough or wasn't on a large enough scale to wipe out, or mainly wipe out, the native Britons. That seems to confirm that the Anglo-Saxons were never a majority in the lands that they conquered, or maybe there wasn't any conquest at all. But the point is, this seems to confirm that there wasn't a mass migration which replaced the native Brythonic inhabitants of England. Then, in 2020, there was another study which found basically the same thing once again. This had the same method. It looked at modern English DNA and compared it with DNA from medieval Anglo-Saxon samples. And this found that about 31% of modern English DNA is attributable to the Anglo-Saxons. So once again, we find that it looks from these studies that the majority of the English are actually descended from the native Britons, and that therefore the Anglo-Saxons didn't wipe out the natives, but actually were always a minority in the land, and that the native Britons just adopted Anglo-Saxon culture, and that is the true origin of the English, and that actually there was no mass ethnic cleansing or displacement of the natives. That's what these studies from 2015 right through to 2020 seemed to show. Now, obviously, that does disprove the minimalist idea, like the theories of Francis Pryor. However, that seemed to tie in well with the, let's say, centralist idea, which was that there was some migration, but it wasn't anywhere near on the scale of what the medieval historical documents seemed to describe. This idea of mass displacement of the native inhabitants, the native population, that doesn't seem to be reflected in the genetic evidence. So these genetic studies seems to confirm this more moderate view. However, that changed in 2022. So in 2022, there was a study published in Nature which looked at just medieval DNA. It looked at DNA from actually before medieval times, from the year 200 right through to the year 1300 CE. So this covered the whole migration era and much more either side. And they looked just at the medieval DNA, so they could see how the DNA of the inhabitants of what's now England changed over the years. So this was a very important study, and it showed very clearly which view was right. Now, rather than me telling you what they found, I will read to you what they say in their conclusions. We identify a substantial increase of continental Northern European ancestry in early medieval England, which is closely related to the early medieval and present-day inhabitants of Germany and Denmark, implying large-scale substantial migration across the North Sea into Britain during the early Middle Ages. As a result, the individuals who we analysed from Eastern England derived up to 76% of their ancestry from the continental North Sea zone. And in another part, they write, our results overwhelmingly support the view that the formation of early medieval society in England was not simply the result of a small elite migration, but that mass migration from afar must also have had a substantial role. Now, to be clear, not all of England shows this same high level of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. This is particularly Eastern England that shows this high level of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. But the point is, this, as they note in their conclusions, this confirms the role of mass migration. It confirms that there were parts of England, large parts of Eastern England, where the Anglo-Saxons overwhelmingly outnumbered the native Britons. They evidently killed or displaced the native Britons who were living there. So this proves that the minimalist idea is wrong, and that even the centralist idea doesn't stand up to scrutiny either. What this supports is something much closer to the maximalist viewpoint, which is basically that the medieval historical documents were actually telling the truth. There really was a mass migration of Anglo-Saxons who really did, en masse, displace or kill the native inhabitants of that land. That's what the genetic evidence shows. Of course, there are still people who try to defend the more minimalist or centralist viewpoint, not to do with scale, but to do with the nature of the event. So rather than admitting that what the medieval documents say is right, and that it was a violent migration, there are people who try to defend the viewpoint that Okay, there was a mass migration, but it was basically a peaceful event. This doesn't conform to what we would expect from violent invaders, because what these researchers found is that there seemed to be an equal number of women, Anglo-Saxon women, present as men. So, according to the logic, if it was an invasion, we should find far more male ancestry than female, because of course the men would have been the soldiers. So the fact that we find an equal number of men and women suggests that it wasn't an invasion, it wasn't a conquest, it was just a migration, a peaceful, basically peaceful event. It wasn't anything to do with a large-scale conquest of England. The obvious problem with this objection is the fact that this relies on the idea that the Anglo-Saxons were like the Romans, that they had a sort of empire, that they were invading other lands to conquer, to impose tribute on them, to subdue them and make them accept the Anglo-Saxons as their rulers, like the Romans did. But the Anglo-Saxons weren't like that. The medieval sources make it very clear that the Saxons invaded to conquer and take over that land, to create their own settlements there. To have settlements, obviously, you need women. That's the point. They were trying to invade, to conquer, to live there, to take over that part of Britain as their own land, not just to subdue it and impose tribute on it. So they wouldn't need just soldiers, they would need women as well. They would need normal people there to inhabit the settlements. That's the point of a settlement, it's for normal people to live in. So the armies conquer the land, and then you bring in the normal people, the women and the children, to inhabit it after the armies have conquered it. That's what the medieval sources clearly present the Anglo-Saxons as doing. They were conquering new land, not just subduing it to impose tribute. So no, we wouldn't just expect soldiers, we wouldn't just expect men in the evidence of Anglo-Saxon ancestry there if it was a violent invasion. We would expect women as well. So what we can see from these genetic studies is that they, for one thing, they support the conclusion that there was a mass migration of Anglo-Saxons to Britain, and two, they are perfectly consistent with the medieval traditional narrative that it was a violent conquest. The idea that the presence of women together with men disproves the traditional narrative just isn't true. It's perfectly consistent with it. And in another video, not next week, but in another video, we'll have a look at some archaeological evidence, both from Britain and outside, that this really is what happened. For now though, if you'd like to learn about what the evidence really shows from archaeology regarding the Israelite conquest of Canaan in the Bronze Age and whether that really happened or not, then come back next week for my next video.